Good morning. I'm happy to be here with you this morning, though I wish we were meeting in person. Thanks for being the church in Portage. For those of you who don't know, I am the Heartland Regional Minister for the Canadian Baptists of Western Canada. So your congregation is a part of a denomination that consists of about 170 churches, starting in Manitoba and going west to the island. I grew up in a farming community south of Winnipeg known as New Bothwell. I grew up in a Mennonite home with 8 siblings, though most of them were and are older than me. My wife Mary and I were married in 1992. Mary works for the government of Manitoba. We have 2 children. Our son Micah is a university student and he works part-time, and our daughter Abby works full-time and is a part-time university student. We're grateful for their interests and for their employment, especially these days. I'm going to be reading parts of Job chapters 1 and 2. So if you have your Bibles, it would be great if you could follow along with me. I'll be reading short sections of scripture within the sermon. And as I begin the sermon then, I want to wish you a happy new year. I don't think it's too late. That's what we're supposed to say to each other at this time of year, a greeting brimming with hopefulness and optimism. And it's worth saying. I appreciate hearing it. I like knowing that people are wishing me well for the upcoming year. It's a much better greeting than here's to maintaining in the new year, or hope your worst case scenarios are realized this year. That, of course, wouldn't be nearly as pleasant. And yet there seems to be something that lies behind this traditional greeting that we hear at this time of year. I think people say it because in reality we have no idea as to what type of year people are going to have. Just think back to January 2020. So we wish people happiness because that is the language of hopefulness, a language that is not privy to history or fulfilled circumstances or events. In other words, we wish people a happy new year because we know that there are many occasions that could arise that would not make this upcoming year a happy one. We all know this, and we are affirmed in what we know by looking back in our previous year to discover this is true not only for ourselves, but for others. Perhaps some of you lost some significant money last year in terms of investments. Maybe COVID brought an increase to your work, but perhaps some people you know lost their employment last year. Perhaps some in your congregation experienced tremendous grief in one way or another. Some that we know were fighting illness suddenly, even though they seemed incredibly fit, or they seemed too young to have to fight such serious maladies. So you see, we offer the greeting, Happy New Year, in hope, but we ought not to be presumptuous or superstitious about the greeting. That is, just because we say it to somebody doesn't necessarily mean that now that we've somehow blessed them and now they'll be okay for the rest of the year. Thankfully, as people of faith, as we look to the scriptures for our foundation for life and faith and for guidance, we see that one of the most valuable promises that we receive, bar none, in my opinion, is the presence of God in all circumstances. And so if we have a great year, we can know that God is with us through it all. And perhaps more importantly, if we have a terrible year, we can know that God is with us through it all. I must say that I've been dabbling a bit in the wisdom literature over the past few years. I've spent some time in Ecclesiastes and in the Proverbs. These sorts of books are interested in living well, in developing our emotional intelligence as we seek to follow God. And our passages today also come from the wisdom literature of the First Testament. This automatically means that we are dealing with some very old material. A friend of mine the other day suggested that the book of Job is, in fact, an archaic masterpiece. Some suggest that the book of Job could possibly have been written about the time of Abraham. Others argue that date, but what is sure is that the genre of the book is both narrative and poetry, and its intention is to teach. It is a long story of an innocent man who encounters suffering and has discussions with some friends about the meaning of his significant suffering. At a foundational level, we should take note that the people of Israel were used to thinking in ways that were perhaps more black and white, more either or than what the book of Job actually wrestles with, and maybe even pushes against. We remember the stories about the formation of the Hebrew people. Joshua spoke in language of choosing, obey or disobey. Other books, such as Deuteronomy, spoke of the connection of sin and punishment. If you sin, you will be punished. Not much gray area in there at all. And conversely, there is a tendency in the early writings especially to see a connection between obedience and the blessing of God. For instance, the Ten Commandments promise a long life to children if they obey their parents, and that is only one such example. The book of Job, of course, pushes back against that simplistic understanding of morality. It works to create breathing room for a world that doesn't always work that way. The world is not always black and white. We all know that. There are not always immediate consequences to sin and disobedience. Sometimes the dishonest and unfaithful get rich, and the obedient are seemingly not always blessed. I think of the song Farther Along, sung by Emmylou Harris, for instance, as a reference for that. And so we are then introduced to Job, our main character in this play. Job is, in fact, willing to suffer if his suffer is a consequence of his sin, for then it makes a lot of moral sense. That seemed to be the common worldview at the time, and his friends in the book serve to reiterate that particular belief setting at that particular time. They too think that Job is suffering because he has certainly done something wrong, and the punishment that he's receiving is adequate for that wrongdoing. So with these background thoughts in mind, let's look more closely at Job. Job was a very prosperous man. He was the richest person in the entire area. I'd suggest he'd even be wealthy today. The beginning of chapter 1 describes him as blameless, a man of complete integrity. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He was also devout. He would get up early in the morning and he would offer burnt offerings to God for each of his children. So remember me introducing myself? Clearly, I'm not like Job in a lot of ways. Job seemed to be doing everything right, and things seemed to be going according to plan to the grand moral equation of the time, right? Job was living well, he was obedient, he was pious, and he prospered as a result. So just when it seemed as though this was going to be the pattern of the book of Job, we are introduced to the adversary, the accuser, Satan. It might be easy to think of Satan as the adversary of God, or the adversary of Job, for that matter, but perhaps we need to listen to these passages again, this time thinking of Satan specifically as the adversary against the sort of thinking that too simplistically sees life in black and white, either-or terms. And so we read the first part of the story in Job 1, verses 6 to 12, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord. The accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and he stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take everything away that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. So there's a lot going on in these verses, but a few things need to be clarified. First, the heavenly court is human language describing a royal court. The king, God, has summoned his courtiers to a meeting to discuss important things. Second, the devil has not been invited. In fact, he shows up uninvited, and he goes about his work, or what he thinks is his work. There is a situation here that needs testing, according to the accuser. He thinks Job only serves God because God has blessed him. That situation needs some quality control. The accuser thinks that with the right amount of adversity, Job would give up his worship of God, remove the blessing, and Job becomes faithless. In essence, then, the accuser says that the Lord has put a hedge of protection around Job, and as a result, Job blesses God. Take away that hedge, the accuser says, and Job's blessing will turn to cursing. Interestingly, the Lord is willing to let this play out. He gives the accuser permission to bring calamity upon Job's life with one disclaimer: he must not harm Job physically. The accuser agreed, and this is what happened after that. Job chapter 1, verses 13 to 19. One day, when Job's daughters and sons were feasting at the oldest brother's house, a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news: your oxen were plowing, with the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabeans raided us. They stole all the animals and killed all the farmhands. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news: the fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, a third messenger arrived with this news: 3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news: your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly, a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Apparently, the accuser plays for keeps. With meticulous precision and with incredible swiftness, and almost in unison, and on large scale, Job's animals are taken from him, his servants are killed, his children are killed, and he's left with his wife and his house. So you can imagine, at the conclusion of this scene, that the accuser moves forward to the edge of his seat, waiting to hear of Job's conversion to the dark side. Instead, this is what we get from Job in verses 20 to 22. Job stood up, tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and he fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. So apparently, the accuser was disappointed with Job because Job responded with grief and praise to God, worship, in fact. And I'd suggest that that's a good way to live. Job did not sweep these events under the carpet and move on as if they were insignificant, because they were not. Instead, in his mourning, Job covers himself with ashes and he shaves his head to help identify with death and the dead. He also tore his garments, which signified that something had happened and something significant had been torn away from his life. And after all of these physical actions, Job utters a confession ending with praise. And in that confession, he confessed to the complete dependence of human life upon God as the giver of life. Even in the misfortune and the removal of material blessing and wealth, Job turned to bless God. There is a second scene to this play, much like the first. Apparently, the accuser wasn't impressed with Job's response, though perhaps he hadn't that he hadn't tightened the screws enough and decided to up the stakes somewhat significantly. Again, uninvited, the accuser appears at the heavenly court, and once again, Job was the topic of conversation. Here, then, the nature of events as described in Job chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. One day, the members of the heavenly court came again to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil, and he has maintained his integrity even though you urge me to harm him without cause. Satan replied to the Lord, skin for skin. A man will give up everything he has to save his life, but reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, "Do with him as you please," the Lord said to Satan, "but spare his life." So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. So apparently, the accuser's first litmus test for faith wasn't difficult or arduous enough. So he increased the terms of his agreement with the Lord to include attacking Job's physical health, excluding death. The Lord agreed to the terms, and Satan was on his way again. And wasting no time, he afflicted Job with boils from head to toe. You'd think that Job would be ready to throw in the towel, ready to curse God and die. He does not. Instead, Job 2 verses 8 to 10 records Job's response to the added difficulty of boils on his own body. Job scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery as he sat amongst the ashes. And his wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job replied, "You talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad?" So in all of this, Job said nothing wrong. While Job, apparently still on the ash heap, starts picking at his boils with some broken pottery. It's a marvelous image of how difficult his life had become, as his affliction had made him so repugnant that about the best use of his time was to sit there and pick at his scabs and sores. His wife is not very sympathetic here. She comes by and tells him to leave all that integrity stuff behind, curse God, die. Regardless, Job's response is telling of a man of deep faith. He firmly tells his wife that she's got it wrong. Instead, in a wonderful statement for people of faith around the world and for ages to come, Job says, "Should we only accept good things from the hand of God and never anything bad?" In other words, Job says, "I trust that God knows what he's doing. God, in his providence, still cares about me, despite my really difficult circumstances." So what are we supposed to do with this passage? Are there such things as heavenly counsels still going on? Does God only bless the obedient? Does the devil set illness upon us? And is he still prowling around, watching everything that's going on? Does God send stuff, bad stuff, our way? I'm not certain about all the details, but there are a couple of themes that I think are important for us as we consider the upcoming year. First, this passage reminds us that life is not a neat package, set into either or scenarios or black and white patterns. We may think that we're living right, giving enough to the kingdom of God financially and of our time, and feel as though we too have some sort of hedge of protection around us, kind of like some cosmic insurance. And when we think and behave in this way, we fall into trouble, for our motives then, for faith, are simply the blessing of God. The devil sees through it, and so does God. This passage reminds us that there are no guarantees. Life is messy. We may experience calamity ourselves, even when we follow God. In short, when the gloves are off, the hedges of protection are gone, and life seems to be beating us up, will we still believe? Another theme, this arising from Job's response, a response that is very important for our day and age. No matter what came to Job, he kept on trusting that God still held all things in his control. Job never lost sight of the fact that God knew what he was doing and trusted him with the big details. So, what does 2021 hold for you, for us? In a very real sense, we do not know. What we do know is that God holds all things together. Our job is to trust God no matter what comes. One more thing. I'll conclude where I began. A Happy New Year to you.